Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath. And today we have another Therapist Confidential short, why our crack staff works on the new website and all the cool new tools. All that stuff's above my pay grade. They just make the magic work. But I can't wait for you to be able to see the new psychotherapy.net website. In the meantime, we have some short, hopefully hard-hitting and interesting Therapist Confidential episodes. And today we're looking at, well, let me put it this way. How many of you, when you started therapy, the person sitting across from you says, "Hey, how long is this supposed to take anyway?" It's an interesting question, isn't it? And usually we have some kind of answer as therapists. Well, it can take a varying amount of time. We give some non-answer answer, right? And to a certain extent, that's fair because we don't know exactly how long it's going to take. But there are very different philosophies in our field about that very question. I mean, some therapists would say therapy should be short. It should be highly focused. It should be quantifiable and measurable. And then others will say, look, real therapy, quote unquote, real therapy or deep therapy takes years. Now, of course, we know what insurance companies prefer and third-party payers. And that's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? The way that late capitalism continues to weave its way into our work, for better or for worse. So insurance companies love brief therapy. Instagram loves, huge breakthroughs, right? And not just Instagram, but all the social media, the amazing thing that your therapist says that changes your life. Therapists seem to be split about this, as near as I can tell. Some preferring more short-term, some more long-term. And then clients are often just confused. So if clients are wondering whether they're staying too long or leaving too early, they're not alone. And if therapists are asking, how long should this be? I'm not really sure. They're not alone either. And in this brief conversation today, I'm really not here to talk about necessarily which is better, but just trying to understand a little bit more about brief therapy, a little bit more about long-term therapy, and what kind of work it might help us do. So, in brief therapy, usually there's a specific focus. Usually there's, specific symptoms that are targeted. Often it's somewhere between like 5 to maybe 10, 15, even 20 sessions. It tends to be very goal-oriented, structured. Certainly in the last 2 decades or so, manualized approaches have really helped define brief therapy. There's lots of research around brief therapy on things like panic attacks, sleep issues, phobias, all kinds of behavioral change, etc. The strengths of this approach when it's working for people is that it can be efficient. It can be reasonably accessible. It can definitely be effective. There's lots of research support. I think one of the criticisms is what sort of depth is happening here? Is brief therapy shallow therapy? And I think the answer to that, to be fair, is maybe sometimes. Longer term therapy, what we're doing here, we tend to explore patterns that happen across time, right? Might be looking at things like attachment, certain longer standing relational dynamics. And there isn't necessarily a clear endpoint. So the focus in longer term therapy often is not how do I get rid of this symptom? It might be more questions like, hey, why does this pattern keep repeating? Hey, what's happening here when I end up feeling abandoned? Or how do I experience myself in relationships? These kinds of questions. Probably more existential questions are a good fit for longer term therapy. It can be hard to entertain deeper existential questions in 5 sessions, although, you could probably get a lot done actually in 5 sessions with it. But traditionally, existential questions are usually entertained in longer term therapy. So it's about depth, process, relationship, meaning, those sorts of things. And the hope is that it isn't just endless processing, but more that it's kind of like iterative relational work. All right, so which is best? Tell me, podcast guy, which is best? Whew, I don't know that I can answer that question, to be honest. There are some struggles that people are up against in the world, which may be more skill-based. Some may be more relationship-based, right? So, for example, for a person that is experiencing panic that gets triggered by driving to work, let's say, or driving anywhere, brief therapy could work really well there. There's something really specific that's being targeted, right? But if someone, let's say, was, what's a typical one? They want to examine why they continue to choose emotionally unavailable romantic partners. Now, maybe there are skills around this, but I think a lot of folks would argue that, skills may not be enough. The problem may or the pattern may reemerge. And that deeper relational exploration is needed. So one way of looking at this is to say, if one's suffering is primarily behavioral, well, maybe brief therapy is the way to go. If the suffering is maybe more relational or feels developmental, maybe it takes longer. But here's the thing. There's not a rule to this. You could take someone that is really struggling relationally and they could have 1 or 2 sessions with someone and that could be enough and it could be really useful. And there could be examples where people have something like struggling with panic, right? And brief therapy is not working. So there isn't just an easy rule to this. I mean, I'll tell you, having had the good fortune of watching David Epstein work and narrative work, I mean, I've seen single sessions that have been transformative in his work. And at the very least, I mean, I would say 3 to 5 sessions, pretty typical, that he'd do really amazing work. So some of this I want to point out too isn't just about what the client might be up against. That's a part of it. But also who is the therapist and how does the therapist work? I think it's fair to say that there is no therapist that's a great fit to work with everybody. I mean, we'd like to think that as therapists, right? We'd like to think hey, I could work with anyone and I'd be great for anyone. And, probably there are some people that we're better suited to work with due to a combination of factors, right? So maybe some of this is even sort of the selection process and who we match with. And maybe some people respond to certain therapists better. And if a therapist can tend to work pretty well in a short time frame and they get a person who responds to that, then a lot of change could take place pretty quickly. But maybe you'd get another person with that same therapist and you wouldn't quite have the same outcome. So maybe some of it's just the sort of selection effects that happen, right? I have noticed that there tends to be some hidden shame on both sides, meaning the client and the therapist, and also different types of shame that might show up for people practicing brief therapy and longer term therapy. So people practicing brief therapy, there can be this therapist practicing brief therapy, there can be this doubt of like, is this enough? Am I actually avoiding something that's deeper? And in longer term therapy, it can show up like, why am I still here? Shouldn't I be done by now? And both clients and therapists can ask similar questions of both of these, right? So I think those are really normal questions that come up. And I think speak to this idea that there isn't just one way to do this. It isn't just that brief therapy is better or longer term therapy is better. So maybe some helpful questions, like if this comes up for you, and it often does, especially for people who are newer to therapy at the beginning, clients will say, hey, how long is this supposed to take? And maybe instead of answering that question, we can encourage the clients to ask questions like, hey, what kind of change are they actually seeking? Are they looking for relief from something or to restructure something in their life? Are they hoping for like a reduction of symptoms or a whole sort of repatterning way of doing relationships? Are they looking for support during a particular season of their lives, or do they want to do deeper identity level work? And what's interesting about this is sometimes you start brief and you go longer. Sometimes maybe you start off going deeper and then you kind of taper back. Sometimes people come to therapy for a little while and maybe it's shorter term, but then they return later in life. So in this way, therapy can be episodic, right? In a lot of ways, the quote unquote right length of therapy is actually the one that matches the depth of the work the person is hoping to do, right? The person who consults us, what are they wanting out of this? For me, I have worked with people sometimes for just a single session. And I don't mean the kind of session where they come and they leave because they don't want to come back. All of us who've been therapists have experienced that, of course, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. No, I'm talking about one session where they got what they needed and they were done. And I've been working with people for over a decade, which is kind of, as a narrative therapist, I'm not supposed to acknowledge that, right? Because we're supposed to be brief therapists. So for me, the way that I approach this, when people say, should it be brief or should it be longer term? My response is, it depends. Because I have people who have come and consulted me, and what they want is sort of continuous conversation about their lives. And I have seen people who come in with a very specific problem they want solved. And so for me, to be honest, even though narrative therapy informs the work I do, I don't identify as a brief therapist or as a long-term therapist. What I try to do is get a sense of how I can be most useful for that person, regardless of if it's a brief time period or a longer time period. Now, is that the right way to do it? No. I'm just being transparent with all of you about how I do it, right? That doesn't have to be how you do it. But what I want to invite you to do is to know why you're doing what you're doing. If you're just saying, well, I do brief therapy. Well, why do you do brief therapy? Because that's what I was trained to do. I might dig a little deeper with that. And same thing with longer term therapy. So you could do one or the other or some and some, but I do want to invite you to consider why it is you're doing what you're doing. And hopefully, whatever we're doing is in service of the people we're seeing and not so much in adhering to a particular ideology about how long therapy should be. All right, everyone. Thanks for hanging out again. Always fun to be in conversation with you, and I will talk to you again soon.